in today's lesson we're going to be looking at what a 6-mark question might look like for the topic of B6 when it comes to your GCSEs, and we're going to look at one question. Welcome to What's Your Question? Let's go. Your start today then is just one question. What is genetic modification? Pause the video here, have a think about the question and have a go at it, please. We'll go through the answers after you've written something down. Fire it in the comments if you want to, or you can write it on paper and just do it for yourself. I'll pause here so you can pause the video. Have a go. Right, so genetic modification then is just us editing the genetic material of an organism to make it more useful to us or to help it not have a specific disease or something along those lines. We're just editing genetic material to make it more healthy or generally more useful for us. Because the only thing we're looking at today is 6-mark questions, we've really got one objective. It shouldn't take us long to read through it then, just looking at some long answer exam questions that you might come across. This question links to genetic modification, specifically genetic modified plants. In this case, we're looking at something called BT corn. If you look at the question here, that you can see there is a section in a box that says read the information about one example of genetically modified crops. It tells you that for a very important reason. Reading that information is going to be important to answering this question. So I'm just going to read through everything it says here. So you do get through that. It says, BT corn is a genetically modified sweet corn plant. The plant produces a poison which kills insects. This means the farmer no longer needs to use insecticides. The genetically modified sweet corn is called BT corn because the insect-killing gene in the plant comes from the bacteria Bacillus thuringiensis. Some people are concerned insects may become resistant to the poison. Explain how the insects may become resistant and discuss if BT corn should be produced or not. So we need to break this question down before we can answer it, and the best way to do that is following 4 main steps. I refer to them as decode, plan, answer, and check. Each of those steps is what you should be doing in any 6-mark, or really any question that you come across, just to make sure you're answering everything in full. Your first job should be to read through the question once fully, paying full attention to what it says, because if you don't read it, you're going to miss out on the simple marks. If you have highlighters, it'd be a really good idea to go through and highlight exactly which parts of that are important. Okay, and I've done that for you here. You can see that I've highlighted in this all the important information is in green, so that stuff that I've read through in the box that it tells you to read, I've highlighted green there because that may be relevant to us answering our question. I've highlighted the command words in yellow and also specifically what we should be talking about in our answer in purple. Our command words here are to explain and discuss, and we should be able to work out where our marks are for just by knowing those 2 command words are there. We're explaining how insects might become resistant, and we're discussing if we should produce it or not. Okay? So there's 3 things for us to talk about there: how they become resistant, if BT corn should be produced, and if it should not be produced. Because we're going to have to discuss as well full marks here, we're more than likely going to have to talk about our own opinion and justify it as well. So to break that down then, after decoding, our next step is to plan what we're going to do. There's 3 main steps to our plan here. We need to look at, first of all, how the insects might become resistant. We know that this generally happens in things like, we know how it happens in bacteria. We know that bacterial resistance to antibiotics happens because a mutation happens and that one bacteria passes that mutation that makes it immune to the antibiotic onto other bacteria. It's going to be very similar here in the plants, as that's how resistance to anything generally happens. So you talk about mutation, and that mutation being passed on through the general population as the offspring are born. So as we move through, time passes, more and more of them will become resistant to that insecticide. We're then going to have to talk about reasons why it should be produced and reasons why it shouldn't be produced, and also state our opinion somewhere as well. We're probably going to look here, because there's 3-4 things to talk about, 2 marks-ish for each of the things we're going to say. So I'd recommend you spending a lot of time thinking about how things become resistant to insecticides, how reasons why we should be producing this crop, and reasons why we shouldn't be producing this crop. Okay, so if you were doing this in an exam, I would take the paper that we have where we've got the lines, and I'd split off a section of those lines, and I'd make sure I wrote those things down, the margin that I would have then made. so I can tick them off as I do them. This way I'll be able to make sure that I've made a full attempt at all the different things that I've been asked to do. And any 6-mark question, you should be able to break down exactly what it's looking for you to do here. I'd like you to pause the video at this point, and I'd like you to have a go at answering that question. It doesn't have to be written brilliantly, you can just write it in bullet points, but you need to make an attempt at it in some way, because if you don't write anything down here, you're not going to be able to remember how to do this as well. You can go away and look up on the internet. I'm not saying do it without researching. If you don't know anything here, go and look it up, but have a go, write out a 6-mark answer, and we'll go through the answers together. I'll pause here so you can pause the video and go and do that. Great. So now you should have an answer written down that you can look at. Before we move on to our final step of marking, we're going to check the answer that you've written. Have you made sure you talked about how the insect has become resistant to the insecticide? Have you talked about the reasons why we should be producing this genetically modified plant? If you have, great. You should have said more than one reason. Have you said why we shouldn't be producing this crop? If you have, great. Again, you should be saying more than one reason. Have you justified your answer? Have you made your own decision about this and said, I think this because this? There's probably going to be a mark for that. If you haven't done any of those things, now's a great time to add them in. Right, so final thing, the mark scheme. There's 3 levels to any 6-mark answer that you may be given. Level 1 is 1 and 2 marks, level 2 is 3 and 4 marks, and level 3 is 5 to 6 marks. You can see here clearly how they break down the marks you're going to get for this question. For 1 to 2 marks, you will have very briefly explained how the insects become resistant. Okay? 2 marks just for explaining that, if that's all you've done. 3 to 4 marks is going to be for an explanation as to how insects become resistant. You should identify suitable reasons for the production of this corn and reasons why it should not be produced as well. So it should be reasons for the production and a reason why it should not be. Yeah, so what things is good about it and one thing that means we should not produce that. 3 and 4 marks here, you do not have to have made any conclusion about what you think at all. When they read through your answer here, they'll decide on based on what you've said, which of these 3 sections they think you fit into. If you've made clear arguments and have backed up everything you've said, you're going to be pushing yourself towards the top end of this chart anyway. So the better you are at communicating, the better marks you're going to get for this question. Finally, level 3, you would have given an explanation how it has become resistant. That's the same as level 1 and 2. You would provide a balanced argument with more than one reason for both being produced and not being produced. More than one just means 2. That's all it needs to be. And concludes an answer backed up with scientific reasoning. You should have backed up your answer with one of the things you said that links to science in some way. Okay? Make sure you read your answer now and read and say which of those 3 sections do you think your answer fits into. Because before you've even looked at what the marks are for, that's what you should be deciding here. Where do I think I fit? 1 or 2 marks, 3 or 4 marks, 5 or 6, based on those points. Final thing then, what are the marks for? So, when it comes to talk about how our insects became resistant, we're going to mention the idea of a mutation making them resistant. We're going to mention the idea of there being a large population, some of them resistant and some of them not. There is variation in that population. We're going to say some are resistant. We're going to say that those resistant ones are going to outcompete the ones that aren't resistant. And we're going to say that those resistant bugs will survive. Those resistant insects will survive and the ones that aren't resistant will be killed off by it. In this way, you'll be left only with the resistant insects. The pros of our BT corn is it reduces the use of insecticides. People don't like the use of chemicals on their plants because they end up getting into our bloodstream and end up getting into the other animals that eat those insects as well, which we'll come back to in a second. This means less insecticides getting into the environment, which means there's less chance of what we call bioaccumulation, which is what I just mentioned, those animals further up the food chain eating the insects that have then eaten the insecticides and that travelling through the food chain. The farmer is less likely to be harmed as he doesn't need to spray insecticides. Certain insecticides can be harmful to the person spraying them, so they don't have to do that. They're less at risk, and more crops could be grown in places that can't afford insecticides. It means that in countries that struggle to grow these things, they can grow more crops. It's one of the reasons why rice is so fantastic in those countries where they grow it in large amounts because it's resistant to a lot of those insects and they can grow it in large amounts. The problems with this is that poison could still get into the animals higher up the food chain, because there is still going to be some insecticide left over. The gene may get into other plants and can result in the death of insects not feeding on these specific crops. Sometimes it can be passed on or spread further by animals moving the seeds further away, and then other animals end up eating the plants, and we have big issues with that. And finally, the gene may get into other plants that could result in more growth of weeds. And if the weeds then have this gene, those weeds will be resistant to the insecticides as well, and we're going to get more weeds than we've ever had before, which is a huge problem. So you should decide how many marks you got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. How many marks you got down in the answers or the comments underneath. Thanks very much for watching. Make sure you stay safe, stay alert, stay curious, and subscribe.